We don't travel to escape life. We travel so life doesn't escape us. And it's long past time we got back out there. So where to? Dulles International Airport. Let your imagination soar. Book now at flydulles.com/nonstop.
This is Ralph Rensler, director of the Smithsonian Bicentennial Folklife Festival. If you enjoyed the festival, you'll be interested in this invitation.
Ladies and gentlemen, an opportunity like this cannot be taken for granted.
This evening, we are going to be beating our hearts out for you all, so I want to see people enjoying themselves. So get up and feel the music and do something about it, okay?
This event is a right of cultural democracy.
We have many, many partners, you included. I encourage you to stand alongside with us as we travel this journey year after year.
I don't know if there is any other place like Jonesborough on the face of the earth. There are storytelling festivals all over the country. There are storytelling festivals in Europe. But this really brings people from all over the place, both tellers and listeners.
This whole storytelling revival helped educate people that storytelling really is, it's in our bones, it's in our DNA.
The relationship between an audience and a storyteller is like tasting an apple. You don't know if the flavor's in the mouth or in the apple. And it's true, there's something that happens in between the two that you just can't get anywhere else.
The big question is not, did I say it? The big question is, do they see it? What are the images a listener is going to generate by listening to what you're telling?
It felt like being at home in the company of all of these incredible storytellers. And, you know, this is a group of incredible story listeners as well.
The best performers in the world are performing in front of the best audience in the world.
I mean, they laugh and sing along and clap and are totally with you.
And just the give and take makes it the best place to hear, to tell a story.
Every moment that I have not been actively on stage, I've been singing the praises of every single detail of this festival.
It's like a family reunion, even if you don't know anyone there.
All right, good afternoon, Washington, D.C. Give us a wave.
Hello, hello.
Woo. Well, thank you for attending. Thank you for being here. My name is Kiran Singh Sirah. And as you can tell by my accent, I have deep roots in the South, in North Carolina, Tennessee. No, it's a joke. I live in Tennessee, and I've been in this country for about 12 years. And I'm a storytelling advocate, storyteller, and folklorist, and peace builder. And it's my pleasure to welcome yourselves and to facilitate this panel. We're going to hear from our storytellers on stage, but first I just want to give a little intro to welcome you to the 2023 Smithsonian Folklife Festival, a festival that's been happening on this national mall for over 50 years to explore, exchange the power of culture and creativity in our lives. There are two programs as part of the festival, the Ozarks, Faces and Facets of a Region, and on that side, and on that side, we've got Creative Encounters, Living Religions in the United States. Now, the Smithsonian Folklife Festival is produced by the Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage and presented in partnership with the National Park Service. Please visit the Smithsonian Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage online. They do amazing work all year round and put on this festival. The festival is also supported by some federally appropriated funds, the Smithsonian Trust Funds, contributions from governments, businesses, foundations and individuals, in-kind assistance, food, recording and craft sales. Now it also receives promotional support by the Metropolitan Washington Airports Authority and Washington Metropolitan Area Transit Area Authority. You gonna remember that? Okay. But this particular program, Creative Encounters, receives support, generous support from the Lilly Endowment and also from other cultural institutions. The Latino Initiatives Pool, administered by the National Museum of American Latino, and the Asian Pacific American Initiatives Pool, administered by the Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center. I want to thank all our technical staff, our live streaming staff, the stage managers, our interpreter for being and making this possible. But I also want to thank you. Storyteller Kevin Kling says storytelling is like two wings of a bird. One of those wings is a storyteller, the other is the listener, but you need both to fly. So thank you for being here and making this festival possible. All right, now our session today looks at the healing power of stories. I introduced myself, but one of the things we talk about in healing power of stories is storytelling as a gift of hope that not only enriches lives, but can be a force for peace and help bring balance to the world. Today we're going to have a conversation about the healing power of stories. But first, an overview of storytelling. There's an idea that the greatest force in the universe is the power of thought, but the greatest means to communicate that thought is through story. In a world that doesn't always make it easy to hear other people's stories, stories are truly a form of magic. Stories give us the ability to imagine ourselves in other people's shoes. And this act of the imagination is one of the most unique gifts of being human. It's a form of time travel. A story has the power to hold time and stop time. It's the art, creativity, and the pulsating beat that exists in each and every one of us and can elevate us all to become storytellers. Stories allow us to contemplate different perspectives in the world, but expose ourselves to the wonders of the world to which we may have been totally oblivious, to get a little closer to understanding reality in its fullness. There's a metaphor in storytelling community, sharing the fire, something that our ancestors have done for many thousands of years, and we still do today. But I believe it started before then. It started when our ancestors could look up into the sky, saw the stars, and began to use their imagination. Imagination is the birthplace of stories. It sparks curiosity and helps us make sense of a world full of connections and possibilities. Some years ago, I met a storyteller in a restaurant in New York City, and he said in his home village in Sierra Leone, the word for medicine is story. Tom Belt, an elder in the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indian, suggests that stories are the cosmology of his people. Catherine Tucker Wyndham, a matriarch for the American storytelling movement, talks about storytelling. What it does is teach us to listen. Alex Haley, author of Roots, said that without storytelling, we'd have no roots. And NEA Heritage Fellow, Mama Linda Goss, a co-founder of the Black Storytelling Movement in America, she said that storytelling is medicine for the spirit and healing for the soul. The indigenous peoples of this place and across this nation and around the world continue to be the traditional custodians of the ancient art of storytelling. But it's also a truly democratic art form, of, for, and by the people. It belongs to all of us. And one of the greatest tools to build empathy, connection, and peace across differences. It's a spiritual practice, but it's also not just for social change, it is social change. We're going to hear from 3 storytellers, Jean Tagaban, Queen Noor, and Marideth Sisco, that understand this work, continue the work, and are continuing to preserve the tradition of storytelling and tell stories for these purposes. I'm going to ask our 3 storytellers to give a brief intro just about your work as a storyteller, how you identify. And I'm going to start with Marideth Sisco as our eldest on the stage. With respect, our elders go first. So Meredith, would you like to go first?
Yes, I'm the one most likely to fall over before it's all over. But I won't, I promise. Golly, I started learning about storytelling literally at my ancestors' knees. Our habit on summer nights was to sit out on the porch in the dark and listen to the owls and the coyotes and such, and tell stories to one another, or remind one another of stories that we knew in the past. And I started this when I was 2 years old. I discovered that if I was quiet enough and I closed my eyes and pretended to be asleep and maybe crawled under the rocking chair, they'd let me stay. And then I could hear the good stories, the ones that they didn't share with just anybody. And I grew up in that tradition. I've been in that tradition ever since, and I've finally evolved to a place where I can't help telling stories. And my friends have to say, Meredith, we've heard that 3 times. Time to hush. And I do until another story comes up. I do my best. But I guess that I'd have to say that the reason I'm a storyteller is that I can't help it. So that's my story.
Thank you, Meredith. Gene.
Yes, Gonachish. It's really good to be here. I'd like to acknowledge being on the lands of the Piscataway peoples, the indigenous peoples, the original peoples of this land. And I come from Southeast Alaska, Cherokee, Tlingit, and Filipino. I tell people I'm a Cherokee Tlingitino. My Tlingit name is Gayao. I first started listening to stories is probably, I share the story of, I was born in the village of Chicagoan in Chicago. And I tell people that my first crib was a dresser drawer with blankets and a pillow, and my mama would say that, oh, he was such a good boy that you never cried, but if you did, we would just close the drawer. You know, and I love that imagery of that. And I love those closed places, but my first experience of actually listening to the stories was when my mama was pregnant with me, and I was inside my first home. And my great-grandmother would call up from Alaska, Southeast Alaska, and she would pick up the phone and she said, let me talk to that baby. And my mother would put the phone up to her belly, and my great-grandmother would start speaking to me in the language, talking to me, singing to me, and telling stories. And some of the stories I heard and I still tell to this day, before I was even born into this world. And so when did I become a storyteller? It was even before I was born, just listening. As you said, one of my teachers said, in order to be a storyteller, first we are story listeners. And again, sitting next to our elders' knees, sitting to them, listening to the stories, and reflecting on those stories as well. And I have so many stories as well of just listening, of those times that I was listening, and that's what my mother said. Now my father recently passed on, and I've been asked to take over in many aspects of the family. And I asked my mother, how did I get called into this? And she simply said, because you listened.
Mm-hmm. That's beautiful. Thank you. Thank you, Jane. Queen.
Assalamu alaikum. Peace and blessings, everyone. It's lovely to see your wonderful faces. Storyteller. When I grew up in North Philadelphia, and then I moved to Willow Grove, Pennsylvania. I always lived with my parents, and my grandmother was there from the beginning. When my father married my mother, my mother asked him, can my mother come? My grandmother used to tell us stories about her life in Virginia and her fishing. And then I had a grandfather, that's my maternal grandmother, but my paternal grandfather, back in the day we used to visit, I don't know that we visit like we used to visit. Visit was a tradition. Now we're either, digitally visiting or not visiting or not taking that time to nurture, but we used to visit. And so I used to visit my grandfather. My grandfather had a 1921 Polaroid camera. And so he preserved his pictures. If you come to my home today, you find them in the trunk of his of my great-great-grandmother Vesey, which was, which is in that lineage. So it's over 150 years old. So his pictures, we would get to look at his pictures and then ask him questions about those pictures, whether they were young boys in knickerbockers standing in the line and age, or that you saw that, African Americans uploading into a truck to go over the lawn side because that's where they had the party, or to go to Chicken Bone Beach. So we were able to hear those stories by watching those pictures. I actually started performing storytelling, becoming a storyteller formally. First I wrote when I was in preschool, when I was in a preteen, I wrote my first poem, and it was Crispus Attucks. And my father recorded me to jazz music. And my father was my first producer. So that's where I started, and I continued. But formerly, my late husband passed away, and my youngest daughter was in kindergarten, or preschool actually, and they asked me to tell stories for Kwanzaa. And so I told one of my husband's favorite stories, which was Abi Yo-Yo. And so when I told that story, then they lost the book. Oh, actually I read it, and they lost the book. I said, I can do this by heart. I went to my son's kindergarten class, and I shared the story and told about Kwanzaa. And those two teachers said, you ought to be a professional storyteller. And that's how it started in 1993.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, and welcome. Now, this title of this session is called The Healing Power of Stories. Storytelling is a big word. It can mean many different things. Healing is a big word. It can mean many different things. What does the word healing mean to you? And what needs healing? How can storytelling help? Oh my. Gene, let's start with you.
Storytelling and healing. It was my uncle, or my teacher, Chris Makua, when I was a young man and my hair was still black. I had no wrinkles and the rocks were soft. Anyways, he sat with me in the longhouse up in Southeast Alaska in Saxman, and the Beaver Longhouse with the beautiful totem poles in it, and the house made out of cedar there. And many times we'd have ceremony there. And he sat me down and he told me, you, now come here. When you talk to the peoples, you got to talk to their spirit. When you talk to their spirit, that's how you're going to influence them. Influence them in a good way. You talk to their spirit. You tell those stories, because those stories, that's how you talk to their spirit. You talk to their spirit. Now go get me a cup of coffee and a cookie, he tell me. But that was it too. It's like stories don't just talk to the mind or talk to the spirit. It breaks through all those walls, all those hurts or wounds. Now people all call them traumas that we have. But it makes its way through because stories are alive. It's a living entity, the stories themselves. And so the stories have a way of making its way through all those wounds to reach to and talk to the spirit of the person, of the people. And so that's when we talk about that healing as well. We're always trying to work and to become that authentic human being that we try to fit in here, fit in there, fit in with this and that, or them or they, but who are we as an authentic human being? And we see it this morning. I saw authentic human beings in the form of children who came and sat with me and worked with me as this morning as I shared some stories and helping them find their stories. And so healing comes in many forms, and to really take a look at that and of where and how can I become that authentic human being that Creator brought me down, had that intentions and meant for me to be. Where can I reach that again? And to take a look at our stories. And I was told that our minds shape the world, but the worlds shape our mind. And part of that shaping of our minds are those stories. What are our stories? And what are those stories that shape our world? And so that's just part of a very long discussion that we could have on and on and on. Yeah. So I'll end right there.
Yes, thank you. It's actually interesting. You reminded me of something a few years ago, right before the National Storytelling Festival, when all the storytellers had gathered, before the festival started, and you gave this brief talk in front of all the storytellers about the importance of the storyteller and the work that we have to do when we are presenting on stage to thousands of people.
I remember that, yeah. And what I said is that we are all healers. As storytellers, we are healers. You know, and first the story, and when we discover that story, though, oftentimes the story discovers us. And the story, it heals us first before we can go out there and start healing the people and telling them the story. There's some stories I hear once and I got it. And there's some stories I can hear it 100 times and I don't have it yet until maybe a couple years or a few years or 10 years down the road, and I'll go, and then finally I'll hear it and I'll go, now it's time for me to tell the story.
Right.
Because I've gone to a certain place in my heart and my healing, now I'm ready. But we're all healers, and I truly believe that.
I believe that too. Meredith, what does healing mean to you? Or what needs to be healed?
Well, what needs to be healed is the world, and all of us. And that's a hard task, and it's a very large task. And you always hope that when you're telling a story and you're trying to convey the meaning of something, that will strike a chord with someone, and they'll say, "Oh, I never thought about that way," or I didn't realize that's how it was, or all those things, to try and not so much correct the narrative as to expand the narrative and make it more understandable in a wider sense. There are some stories that are totally universal. You could tell them to any group of folks, and someone in the crowd would go, "Oh, that happened to me. That was my experience." And then other stories are so deep and so transformational that you hesitate to tell them, because you don't want to throw that thought at somebody who's not ready to chew it up and digest it. You know, if that's why we don't talk politics up here on the stage. It's too raw, it's too new, and all the things that we think about it are things that we will digest and chew over and come to conclusions about, but we're not there yet. So I try to throw my little 2 cents worth in when I think it might make sense to do so, and try not to send anybody down any terrible path. There are stories that I will never tell, but most of them, there will be a place for at some time or another. And I say you, I mean me, I just have to trust my gut to tell me when it's the right time to talk and when the right person to talk to. And sometimes that is more effective than it is others, but you just have to tell your thing and see what happens.
Thank you, Meredith.
Sure.
See, healing, if we think about the African oral tradition, the Jalis, Umagothi, Umwadithis, the griots, the storytellers, part of their role was healing. You can hear that in it. They have many other levels. And following that tradition, although I'm an African-American storyteller, I follow Jaliya, which is the art of storytelling. So within the art of storytelling lies healing, because you have to be present in the moment. In every present moment that we have, we know that healing is necessary. It could be healing on a level of one-to-one with the familiar, with someone else. It could be on the level of healing for self as a storyteller. It could be on the level of healing for community. And that's what I believe when you say the world needs to be healed. That's the world community. Specifically within my tradition of following Jaliyah, I think about healing from generational trauma. And having to tell those stories to heal from generational trauma. And they transfer into individual one-on-one. They transfer when you do to telling stories because you need to heal yourself. And part of that healing of generational trauma is understanding the stories of our ancestors and also being able to tell those stories of the truth from whence we come from and from which we understand in the truth so that we may grow and so that we may heal together, individually, in community, and as a nation.
Beautiful. Thank you so much.
May I add something into
Yes,
that
please.
too?
Yeah,
Yes, you know, and that healing, you see, we've been dreamt into existence. Our ancestors dreamt us into existence. And when we're telling these stories, when we talk about healing as well, is that ancestral healing. Because many of our ancestors passed on with that hurt, those wounds and stuff. And so when we're telling our stories and sharing and learning about our stories, learning about it, and as we tell it, we're also healing those ancestors who have passed on. And so there's that ancestral healing that's happening as well. And those ancestors who we can call on to be with us. There's a lot of wounded ancestors who that a lot happened, you know, and they still and that's a fundamental belief as an indigenous native tribal person from this land here. That's just a universal belief of many of indigenous peoples, you know, across the world, that ancestral healing.
Can I add to that a little bit too? So on Sundays, I belong to a group and we meet spiritually, and it's international. It's led by Sheikh Arianka Mohammed Mendez, and the group is called Ahad, Ancestral African American Ancestral Healing and Development. At one of these meetings, there was a story that was shared by a brother named Yusef, and people go to this brother because of his dreams. And he had a dream that he walked into this auditorium and there was an elder, a wise one, on a stage. And as he walked close to him, that elder embraced him and he began to cry. And the elder said, I was the first Muslim in your family. Later on in the story, you hear that the elder, there's this veil in this auditorium, and he's able to pull back the veil. And he saw throngs of ancestors, and they were praying. They were praying on tashbih, which are the beads that we pray on. But this tashbih went around the people. And in the story, you'll hear him say later on that every single descendant, every blood, tear, and sweat of our ancestors was made into that tashbih. And in that tashbih, that one bead is a dua, a prayer that they never had a chance to utter. And every single African American descendant of enslaved Africans have those ancestors praying for them on that tashbih. And that we too must pray for our ancestors as they are praying for us, because it's about healing.
I'd like to add a little bit to that too. You know, my perception of healing has to do with the world as the natural world, the soil, the rocks, the trees, all that, and all the wounds that were caused by my people, because I'm 94% white, and my people have a lot to answer for. And it goes back lots of generations, and particularly disturbing now are the efforts to shut that up and say, no, none of that happened. It wasn't us. And no, we can't hear that. Our tender ears just can't perceive those things because it would make us feel so sad. Well, baloney. I mean, sorry, but we should be sad. We should be embarrassed lots more often than we are. But it's all the same kind of healing, because we have to learn to be more human and less tribal in our affectations, because we are a part of a larger people, and we all owe it to ourselves to take care of ourselves, not only ourselves but each other, and take care of the land we live on, and the rocks and the trees and the plants, everything, every living thing. Because we are not the top of the food chain. We are just the food chain.
Mm-hmm. I want to build on that, because a lot of you, the three of you, have shared aspects of what brought you into this work: ancestors, traditions, faith, spirituality, heritage, individuals. But I'm sure there's many moments. But can you think of a moment, and I often do this sort of in workshops, rather than sort of say, what's your story? Because we all come from multitudes of stories. Mm-hmm. What was a moment that perhaps made you think differently about the world and your place in that world? Mm. What was a moment that made you realize, perhaps, or one of the moments that led you to do what you do today? And anyone can respond to that.
I'll give that a shot. The main moment for me, when I was a young person, I know that's hard to believe, I was a young person. I went to San Francisco to find my fame and fortune. I thought I was going to be a singer and a songwriter, and I was going to be famous, not having any clue that I was not nearly pretty enough to be out there in front. And I'm way too much ego to be in the back. And coming from the Ozarks has a wonderful, deep-rooted culture, but at the same time, that culture is built on centuries of cultural isolation, where it was just us telling stories to each other about how the world was. And you know what? We were very wrong about most of it. And trying to come out of that and into a better situation, I got into a conversation that got me a job working at a night shift at an answering service. And it was an answering service run by an African-American man. And so he had all the people on the boundaries. He had hookers, he had civil rights organizations, he had social clubs. All the people that none of the other answering services wanted to talk to were on his part. So I was on the night shift, so I got several middle of the night calls by people calling me racial slurs, and I said, I'm sorry, you have the wrong person here. Yeah. But in the middle of all that, and listening to myself talk about it, there was that moment when I realized that what language I had been using to talk to that man up until that point was incredibly insulting to him. And I was absolutely clueless that was the case. And the moment I realized that, and I realized what a shit I had been, I had to change everything. I had to start small and find all those little places where my mouth would open and just be all ready to fire out something that I had learned in the Ozarks. And it wasn't true. And I had to fix all those. I've been working at that ever since. I still screw up once in a while, but I'm working on it.
Thank you, Meredith.
So you talk about those moments and which single moment, and as when you said that, which single moment, you know, and our life is a story, and our life is made up of moments. Our life story is made up of those moments. And my life, when you said that, all these here moments started flashing by, like this moment, there's this moment, there's this moment. There's so many moments that are there that accumulated to get me to that point. And I could speak on all of them, and we would be here a long time. But one moment I want to really point out is when my teacher passed on. He died. And a set of regalia that I danced with, raven regalia and a mask, was made for him. But the group, the storytelling group, the theater company that he was with, approached me and asked me to step in for him. And at that time, I was an outdoor wilderness experiential ed counselor, and I was working with kids, taking kids out onto the land and healing. And they've been through much trauma. And I really enjoyed that job, but out of respect and out of the obedience I have for my elders and teachers, I stepped in and to step into his place. And they presented me with the regalia. They presented me with the wings, and also to step in to start sharing and telling these stories. And so I was acknowledged not only as a dancer and a cultural leader, but also acknowledged as a storyteller. And they to be able to travel on the stage, travel across the country, travel across the world, and to share these stories. And to be honest with you, it took me several years after that to actually acknowledge a worthiness of that, a worthiness, you know. And I'm still working on that and struggling with that as well, you know, of that. But that moment, that's that moment that came into it. But it was an acknowledgement from the people themselves, the clans, the dancers, and those who really acknowledged my teacher, who was a very well esteemed teacher, to be able to. They asked me to step in for him, and I was. And here I am.
Great responsibility.
Yeah. Yeah.
Queen, would you like to share a moment? We have many, but...
Yeah, a moment. Yeah, I was thinking about moments because we have many, because in practicing in Jaliyah, you must be present in every moment. So there's every moment, right? So, but I'm going to talk about in 1993 when I went to the first African American storytelling retreat that Baba Jamal Mitch Capel would give. Dr. Carlise Frink Reed discovered me kind of in Philadelphia and told me about this retreat, and I went to this retreat. So that's where I was introduced to the National Association of Black Storytellers, Mother Mary Carter Smith and Linda Goss, the founders, and the understanding of that we must tell our stories, that we are responsible for telling our own stories, because there has been decades of people taking, and years of people taking, telling our stories, misappropriating our stories, and what stories mean to our individual communities, so many communities. So it was there that I can make this statement, that I know that we all have challenges with life. We have very different challenges. Sometimes it's relationships. Sometimes it might be finding our spirituality. So one of the things that a lot of times we're in search for is our purpose. What is our purpose on this planet while we are here? And it was because of that gathering, that beginning of that gathering, I can say, I know my purpose. And it was a critical changing moment for me, and it has guided me ever since then, from individual to family to community life.
Yep. We, as it happens, time goes really quick when we start telling stories.
Oh, wow.
But we've got about 5 minutes, so I think what I'm going to try and do is close with we've talked about the past and why we do what we do, but I want to talk about present and future. One of the themes of this festival is futurisms. How will we live together and care for one another is one of the guiding questions throughout this festival. But last week, earlier this week, we marked the 4th of July. It's the first time me as an immigrant, as an American citizen, to be on this mall. Thousands of people. Some of us, people in our homes across the country, flew flags. We ate hot dogs. We did what we did. The ideas of celebration of independence and freedom, and getting rid of those Brits, those funny Brits that talk like me. But I want to understand, from your perspective, what does that day, what does freedom, independence mean to you? And particularly, when you think about what story do you envision for this nation, for society?
Wow.
The story I think that I envision is that there's this story that we listen, and that we listen to each other's stories.
Yes.
This is a beautiful ground for the chance to understand one another's stories and to just sit in that and listen to that. So if I was going to present a story around July 4th, I would go back to Juneteenth even. When I tell stories for Juneteenth, I say that Juneteenth is a national holiday, but it began on different shores. So I take that story back to Mother Africa, and that freedom, it was maintained within us, but beyond the bones and the sinews and the flesh, it was in our spirit, and it could never be broken. Therefore, that freedom of my ancestors, I stand upon their shoulders, is the only way that I could be here, because freedom was in their spirit. And so in that universal futuristic, I would like to see that freedom is in the spirit of everyone, and everyone can tell their freedom stories and listen to the stories of others and what freedom means to them.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Very well said. I was thinking about freedom and its corollary was responsibility. And it made me recall a fellow I've known for many years. He's a Shawnee Indian man. He and I were sitting watching television one night at the, I guess the incoming chief of one of the tribes, and the big ceremony, and the fellow walks out and is congratulated and is wearing a fine braided coat, just of beautiful regalia. And he gets into this Cadillac and drives away. And my friend said, "That's no chief." I said, "Why not?" He said, "If he was a chief, there would be somebody in his tribe that needed that car. He doesn't need that car. What's he doing driving that car? He's just being a big shot." And I thought about that, and I thought, well, yeah, driving a Cadillac is not having the responsibility for the people that you're caring for. It's not having the responsibility to step in and do what needs to be done, and to be able to be wise enough to determine what that is. And that doesn't take storytelling, that takes story listening. You don't learn a whole lot by telling your truth. You learn way more by listening to other people's and coming to understand that. And then I think that for freedom, for me, is accepting that responsibility.
Mm-hmm. Yay, Bo. Yay, Bo.
And so each 4th of July, I've been part of the naturalization ceremony in Seattle for about the last 15 years or so. And this year we inducted over 500 new citizens to this land here. And it's an honor to be part of that, to acknowledge and to welcome them onto this land, onto the indigenous lands, or we call Turtle Island here. And so I've been part of that. And so part of it too is my vision for that too is, as each of us walked into the room here, I always wonder who walked into the room with you. What are those stories? What are those ancestors who walked into the room with you? As I'm watching all these people out here walking by, and each and every one of them, I see stories. I see stories. And how can we form our thinking into seeing everyone as a story and wondering, just wondering, what's your story? What's your story? As we have those different heritage and races, you know, and those ancestors, to sit and actually listen. What's your story? Who are you? Who are you? Where did you come from? As those 500 who came in, those naturalization, you know, they came into the country as new citizens. You know, what is their story? What is their struggles? And as Auntie here said, yeah, it might be a hard thing to listen to. It might be difficult, but that's okay. That's okay. To sit and take time just to listen. Take time just to listen. And then reflect on yourself, and ask yourself the question, who am I? Who am I? What is my story? What is my story? You know, and sure, I could say so much about that day, the 4th of July, and you know, when the Constitution actually says we the people, actually means we the people. You know, right. And we get rid of the patriarchy, the masculinity around it, you know, where it's not about white, rich, land-owning men, but we the people actually means we the people. Yeah. And we actually take that on in this land.
Well said.
We have to unfortunately close this session, so I want to thank Jean Tagaban, Marideth Sisco, Queen Nora for sharing your heart, for sharing your stories and sharing your wisdom. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Kiran.
Can I share? Thank you so much. And my teacher once told me, he says, one day that there's going to be a computer that is so well-known, knows everything, it'll be so fast. And that as humans, we're going to go up to that computer and ask that ongoing question, what is the meaning of life?
What is the meaning of life?
And the computer will simply pause and say, let me tell you a story.
A great counterforce to AI, too. Before we close completely, I wanted to let people know that this is being live streamed. It's going to be recorded. Please go back, share it with your friends and family, share it with your children, share it with your teachers, put it with the politicians that need to hear it. But also a quote by Irish storyteller that said, the closest distance between two people is a story. We all have the power to listen, to hear one another. And I'm going to just encourage you to take the feeling, if you don't remember the details, take the feeling that you've experienced in this session, and let's do some healing in the world. Okay, thank you all, and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you.